Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Clarendon Chronicles podcast. My guest today is Sir David Bell. In an amazing career spanning over 40 years, Sir David has held a number of major posts across the UK education system. Between 2012 and 2018, he was Vice-Chancellor at Reading University, preceding his current Vice-Chancellor and Chief Executive post at the University of Sunderland. Previously, he was Permanent Secretary at the Department of Education for 6 years, serving 4 Secretaries of State and 3 Prime Ministers. He also served as Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools for nearly 4 years. Sir David began his career as a primary school teacher and later became a head teacher. He was Director of Education and Libraries with Newcastle City Council and Chief Executive of Bedfordshire County Council, also a Harkness Fellow based in Atlanta, Georgia for a year. In addition to his education leadership, he has numerous charitable and voluntary trustee roles, and he also chairs currently registered social housing provider Karbon Homes, which provides over 30,000 homes for over 100,000 residents in the north of England. And for context, this is where Sir David and I have actually served on the same boards and committees now for some time. Sir David was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath in 2011 and has been made a Deputy Lieutenant of the County of Tyne Wear. Sir David, welcome to my podcast. Firstly, thank you so much for your time today in what I know is an incredibly packed professional and personal schedule.
Jeremy, thank you so much for the invitation and that kind welcome. And I tried to get my children to call me Sir David and it didn't work. So why don't we just stick to David today?
Let's do that. Thank you, David. David, as I mentioned in the introduction, which clearly took some time because there's so much in there, you've completed 40 years and counting in demanding public services roles. May I ask, where did your own personal leadership journey begin? And what is it about education in particular that has drawn you into investing so much of your professional service into this area?
Well, maybe if I start with the second part of that question first, Jeremy, I attended one of the flagship comprehensive schools in Glasgow in the 1970s. And I really felt as if I was surrounded by a group of teachers who were committed to the comprehensive ideal and had themselves benefited from a comprehensive education and wanted the next generations of students to do so. And that was very much my experience. And I had a wonderful time at Knightswood Secondary School. Okay. In those days, the school, comprehensive school, yes, but had prefects and a school captain. And maybe that's the answer to the first part of the question. My leadership journey began as the school captain in the year 1977 at Knightswood Secondary School.
It sounds, I'm smiling because there's quite a number of parallels there, because in terms of role models, I had a similar kind of background. My primary school head teacher was a very impressive individual. We had prefects, we had head boys, and it was the inspiration for me. And I recall doing things like public speaking, for example, at the age of 8 and 9 and having to read out the football report from the previous day. So a parallel introduction to our primary education. They stay with you, don't you, David?
They do. And perhaps you've prompted me and reminded me that I was also involved in the school's debating team, and we took part in the Scottish schools debating competition. And one of the adversaries in that competition was the late Charles Kennedy. You might remember the leader of the Liberal Democrats, a formidable debater even as a schoolboy. And he went on to become a very formidable debater at Glasgow University, where I attended, and also subsequently in politics. And I think debating was one of those areas where I had the opportunity to exercise leadership. But also, I think it gave me confidence, which I hope has retained, has been with me ever since, to be able to speak quite comfortably and easily in public settings. But I think the other advantage, Jeremy, of the kind of upbringing I had was that I don't have any sense of either being intimidated by or looking up or down on other people. I treat absolutely everyone in a very straightforward, open manner, whether that's, if I might say, prime ministers or it's some of our wonderful domestic staff here at the university. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect. And I think my background and my upbringing gave me that sense of egalitarianism and that everyone should be treated properly and equally.
And that leads me on to another area. You talked again about what your, I suppose, ethos is in terms of leadership. Has your style therefore has your style been maintained over 40 odd years? Has it changed at all? 'Cause things were very different. I mean, I'm going back to the 80s when I first started work. You're slightly before me, but have you seen your leadership style and approach have to change at all, and in what ways, if at all?
Well, I hope it has, because I think it would be a pretty sad day if I was exactly the same person I was 40 years ago. I think perhaps somewhat unusually, Jeremy, I became a head teacher of a primary school at the age of 28. Now, when I look back, I think, oh my goodness, why did anyone ever want to appoint a 28-year-old as the head teacher of a school? But actually, ever since, so that is itself almost 40 years, I've been in senior leadership positions. And that's quite unusual because for either good or sometimes not so good reasons, people's leadership careers don't last anything like 4 decades. They might have worked for that length of time, but they've never been in senior leadership positions. So inevitably, I've adapted and changed. I've always been somebody who's taken a keen interest in other leaders, and particularly people that I admire. And I don't try to just copy them, because we all have to have our own leadership style. But I like to think that I've been influenced by many great leaders over the years. And I think, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. And that's been very much my philosophy of leadership. If I can adapt, I can adjust, I can learn from others, and then I become a better leader. Well, what's not to like in that?
I think it's incredibly true. I mean, I go back to my own career. I became a CFO purely almost by accident at the age of 29. And I look back on it and think, what on earth were these people doing, making me into this position at that age? But some of my own leadership examples were outside of the business arena as well. So I played a lot of cricket, and my cricket captains in a very formative age, at the age of 14, 16, 18, when you were spending almost all day Saturday and Sunday with these people, absolutely inspirational role models for me in terms of mixing with people from all walks of life on a Saturday and Sunday for all that length of time. It's so thank you for sharing that. And in all of your time across education and working with government in positions of, you've got much more public accountability than I think I ever have or would do. You must have had to come or deal with pressurized crisis situations. What's your strategy for dealing with a crisis, something that needs immediate attention? How do you manage to do that in all of your roles across your career, David?
Do you remember there was a while when people were wearing that T-shirt, "Keep calm and carry on"?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that probably encapsulated my philosophy. And it's a serious point. I remember I had a great ex-colleague who would rush around furiously if we were in a crisis. And I said to him, just slow down, just calm down, take your time, take a breath, take a step. And I think that's a very serious point about how you handle a crisis. And I remember, certainly when I was at the Department for Education, inevitably working in government, you do have crisis to manage. But, I always just took that breath. I always just slowed everything down. I always felt, and this might seem a somewhat old-fashioned thing to say, I always felt looking smart was incredibly important in a moment of crisis. I am, as I often joke, the only person left on the university campus that wears a tie.
I did wonder today whether I should put one on, but I thought
I am, and the only one. But there was something for me about just looking the part. So when we would go back into a meeting with the Secretary of State, I wanted him or her to look at me and think, yep, they might not have all the answers, but they're in control. And they look personally as well as professionally in control. So I always encourage colleagues just to take that moment or two, steady yourself, look calm, breathe deeply, and break down a crisis or break down a problem, because inevitably you'll get through it, but you just have to take it step by step. And I think more generally, Jeremy, people often say of me, I'm just very even-tempered. And I pride myself on that. I don't get phased, even when things are going a little bit awry. I have a very even approach. And I also think there's an important leadership lesson there, because I want people not to have to guess how they're going to find me when they come across me at work. They mustn't think, oh, is it going to be good David or bad David today? I want them to think it's David, and I know what I get, and I know what to expect. And I think it is a really important point for leaders to be predictable in the very best sense of that word, so that their colleagues know exactly who they're getting day in, day out.
I would absolutely concur with that. I actually found it quite difficult to deal with inconsistency as an executive. What I actually found was okay, not marvelous, but okay, was if somebody was consistently difficult, I could probably deal with that, because they were consistently difficult. If it was the Monday and the Tuesday difference, that actually what I found was quite difficult. And I think there's some great lessons there for us, breaking the problem down. I take the same view now as a non-executive, in that people might only see me for 2 hours a month, maybe only every quarter, and how they see me and actually how I see them, really important to make sure that it's the same every time. So thank you for sharing that.
I mean, I like to think of myself as a very tolerant person, but I'm very intolerant of poor behavior, particularly on the part of managers and leaders. It's just not good enough in my eyes. I expect people to behave in a way that is commensurate with their role and to treat others with dignity and respect. Yes, of course, there are hard conversations you have to have, and I've had a number of those with colleagues over the years, but that is no excuse for poor behavior. And I have to say, Jeremy, it continues to depress me a bit when you read the latest corporate scandal about some chief executive who has just gone completely awry and has a shocking pattern of behavior and has bullied staff. And I think, my goodness, why don't we learn that it's no way to behave, and it's certainly no way to get the best out of people? Absolutely.
I think there's some principles there that stand not only 40 years, but many decades to come, I think. And if I move slightly on to your role within government, David, that's something that the listeners and the audience could not possibly understand much about. You've been permanent secretary to 4 secretaries of state, served 3 prime ministers. Without going into any of the real detail, could you give us a little bit of any kind of insight as to how it works in Westminster, and how do you get things done, and how does it perhaps differ from some of the other roles that you've had? Because it must be so different.
Yes, I think the most obvious point to make, but it's helpful for context, is you are working in a political environment. And that environment can be quite different for many people to what they've been used to, particularly if they haven't, as it were, grown up in the civil service. And you are working to the political rhythms. You are serving elected politicians who've been appointed by the Prime Minister to become ministers and secretaries of state. And life is not always straightforward. Decisions are not always taken in the way in which I'm able to take them now as a chief executive. And for some people, that's very difficult to manage. Some people like clarity. They want things to be done immediately. They think the evidence is clear cut. So why is there a discussion or an argument about it? But that's not politics. And actually, much of what you do as a senior civil servant, certainly as the permanent secretary, was to try to obviously understand what your ministers wanted to achieve, and you wanted to find ways to help them do that, taking account of the wider political, social, economic environment. And that sometimes meant compromise. That sometimes meant not getting absolutely everything you wanted. It sometimes meant endless negotiation with others. And I actually really enjoyed that environment. I was fortunate that I had been working in local government for a few years before going into central government. And then as Chief Inspector of Schools, although I was in government, I was just ever so slightly removed from the main department. So I had quite a good schooling, as it were, in the ways of government, although it was then and still is very unusual for an outsider to be parachuted in as the permanent secretary. In other words, the most senior civil servant in a government department. But actually, if you look at my career, Jeremy, in a number of roles, I've not been an insider. I've been an outsider coming in. I wasn't a full-time inspector when I was appointed Chief Inspector of Schools. I wasn't somebody who had worked in the civil service before I was appointed Permanent Secretary. I wasn't somebody who'd worked in a university before I was appointed a Vice-Chancellor. So I suppose over the years I've acquired, I hope, a wee bit of experience about how you manage those situations. And I think my experience of political environments has proved to be very useful, not just in those environments, but more generally.
And I think it's really interesting what you said there, because it leads on to my next thought process with, you mentioned almost being that element of an outsider into those three areas there. So back to leadership and building a team around you in those areas where you come in from not necessarily the outside, but from a different environment. And you've got so much accountability and so much scope in your roles now. What insights can you share with us to take into our own organizations, maybe private organizations, about building a leadership team and building a team that works around and with you, David?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Jeremy, because we obviously hear of some people who come in as the chief executive or equivalent, and the first thing they do is they clear everyone out and they start again. That's never been my approach. I've always gone in work with the working assumption that the people who are in the senior team around me are going to be my team. Now, of course, as a new chief executive, you get to know your people, you see them in action, you make judgments about them. But if I look back over my working life, the changes that I've ever made in senior teams have always been relatively modest. So I've not been the kind of, the clear out specialist. That's never been the way I've done it. And actually, I've not done it that way. And I think there's probably two reasons for that. First of all, if you clear everybody out at the beginning, who's left to do the important work that you've been appointed to lead within your organization? So, I mean, it's just a very simple, pragmatic point. Why would you do that and give yourself more headache? Secondly, I've not done it because I think an organization looks carefully at how a new leader treats its people. Now, there may be colleagues in the senior levels of an organization that more junior colleagues think, oh, I really don't, I don't rate them, or I don't like them, or they're not very good. But I think if the chief executive just comes in a very cavalier and actually quite cruel manner just dispatches everyone, then I think you set a tone in your organization, and it might not necessarily be the tone you want to set in the organization. So there's something I think about sending out signals about how you're going to behave as a senior leader. And one of the most obvious early forms of evidence is how you treat the senior team. And then I guess the third reason I haven't done it is because, and maybe this is the educator in me, I believe the vast majority of people can improve. Now, if you start off without giving them a chance, how can you improve? Whereas I would want to work with colleagues where I can to help them progress and to develop. And I always say to colleagues, you're never going to have to guess what I think. I will tell you, and I will tell you straight. And my experience has been, Jeremy, that people have always appreciated that straightness, that frank talking. And therefore, if you create that kind of atmosphere with colleagues, then they learn, you learn. And as I say, vast majority of cases, the people that I've had when I've arrived have stayed and have only left either because they've got a new job or because they've retired, not because I've somehow kicked them out.
I think some really clear guidance for us in listening to that, David, because what I say, and I would say this anyway as a coach and a mentor, but I think there's a phrase I use sometimes is that there's this perception of perfection around in any kind of organization where you appoint somebody into a position on the assumption that they're the finished article. And we all know that everybody isn't, and they've all got space to improve. And there's a phrase that I borrowed from somebody else about people stop being a sponge in terms of their ability to improve, and they potentially sometimes become a rock, and we can improve on that. But I think the opportunity to improve and go from 6, 7, 8 out of 10 to 9 or 10 out of 10, I think is really important. And of course, I would say that anyway as a coach and a mentor. But
and Jeremy, I wouldn't apply that just to my colleagues. I'd apply that principle to myself. I mean, I often say, if I'm not learning something new every day, I'm stagnating. So, I do make it a point of principle to try and find something new out. It might be to do with work. It might just be a random fact that I didn't know before. It might be getting to know somebody. And therefore, if you're going to encourage others to improve, you have to commit to that yourself. And people have to see you growing and learning in the same way that you're expecting them to grow and to learn.
I absolutely subscribe to that. I went back to university to do my first coaching and mentoring qualification in 2018, and then I did another qualification at Newcastle University starting 2021 as well. And I've just reached the 40-year anniversary of me going to university. So yeah, never too late to learn, David. If I take your, in addition to what you've said so far, have you got any personal leadership reflections that you draw out of 45 years, or any other challenges that you thought have been incredibly influential in how you approach things?
Yeah. I enjoy reading leadership and management books, and I still enjoy reading such material, but I don't think I would say I necessarily subscribe to any particular approach. I suppose one thing I learned very early on as a primary school teacher was the value of positive reinforcement. It's a very great classroom management technique that rather than concentrate on the negative, you accentuate the positive and you develop and you encourage others to see the good in themselves. And I think I would probably say that approach has stayed with me all the way through. Excuse me, that ability to encourage and motivate others through positive reinforcement is there. So that's one that I would reflect on. The other that has always been important to me and comes naturally to me is just visibility around an organization. And I've just, before we started this interview, I've been with the university student union presidents for an hour, just talking to them and listening to what's on their minds, sharing some thoughts about the future. I just get such a buzz in that engagement and being out and about around the university, as I've always done in my organisation. And I think that's always paid dividends. And again, being pragmatic about it, people might not necessarily agree with everything they do, you do as a leader, but they have to think that you care, and they have to think that you put a decent shift in. And I've always been a great believer in putting a decent shift in. I want people to think, I don't agree with him, but I cannot in any way question his commitment to the business, to the organisation. So that's a kind of second lesson about visibility. And then probably a third point that I've learned, and maybe leaders find this particularly difficult, is not always to think that you must be the dominant voice in the room. leaders think, well, I've been appointed to be the dominant voice in the room. I'm the chief executive, I'm the managing director. I'm this, I'm that. Yes, you are. But yours is not the only voice. You need to be able to learn and enable others to contribute. And actually, I think if we look at some of the worst stories of corporate and leadership excess and bad behaviour, Jeremy, we often can attribute them to people who've just lost the ability to listen. And so I think I've learned over time that the more you listen, actually, the more effective you become, which for some leaders feels counterintuitive. No. The more I talk, I'm more effective. If I talk and I tell. No, actually, you're not. So that's been sort of 3 reflections. I wouldn't say that amounts to a leadership philosophy, but I suppose what I've tried to do is just adapt and adjust over time. And these are probably 3 principles that I feel have served me pretty well in all the different jobs that I've done.
I can certainly vouch for at least one of those as well, David. And I think some of the things you said were really, really important in that if I take the visibility one, my organization in the housing association sector, where I was a non-executive, was merging with one of your organizations. And I remember coming home after the merger committee series of meetings that we had in York, for example. And I remember coming back here and saying, you'll never guess what, Sir David turned up to these meetings. And I literally remember going home and thinking, I was very surprised. But you came to all of the meetings in terms of the merger, and that stuck in my mind, actually. And I think was one of the reasons that our organizations managed to become successful in achieving that merger. Everyone was incredibly visible, not just you from both sides, actually. I mean, if I take the housing association sector that I mentioned there, David, we have a target now of government. I think there was a big target before the government changed in July as well, of building 1.5 million homes in the next 5 years. What kind of role have housing associations, regulated, registered providers got in trying to get to that level of homes, which would be a significant increase in what we've seen in activity levels over the last 5 years, for example?
Yes, it's such an important and vital question, Jeremy. And of course, the short answer is social housing associations, businesses are going to be central to the drive to build more homes, because obviously, as we've seen over recent decades, local authorities have tended to step back from the direct provision of housing, although some of them are coming back into that now. But the social housing sector is hugely important. And actually, if you look across the northeast of England, the social housing businesses have been central to the drive to build more homes. I mean, we take the business that we're both part of, Karbon Homes, building around about 600 homes every year. That's a great contribution, but it's not enough. And we all accept it's not enough. It's not that we don't want to do it. It's just that our means to be able to do it are constrained at the moment. So yes, we need to see what the government's going to do. Is it going to make more money available through direct grant to housing associations? Is it going to find other means and vehicles to make those numbers stack up? There's also other contingent factors, isn't there, Jeremy? Because, for example, we need a construction sector that's got the ability to deliver at the pace at which the government wants. We need, and this might sound quite mundane, but it's very important, we know that local authorities need planning officers and insufficient number to make that happen. We need there to be land available for these developments to take place. Never mind all the important responsibilities we have in ensuring that our existing residents live in the best quality accommodation. So I think it's a big ask of the social housing sector. But one thing that struck me in my 5 years very closely associated with it has been the huge willingness and commitment of people who work in that sector. And I'm sure it's your experience, Jeremy, that the staff who work in social housing are very committed. There's no sense of being patronising or looking down.
Absolutely.
Very much a partnership approach to working with residents to ensure that they live in decent accommodation and or they have the opportunity to get a brand new property built by a social housing business. And our people are unbelievably committed. And I think that's another great advantage. If the government is going to drive forward this change, it's certainly got the people there to make it happen.
I absolutely agree. As you know, I worked as an executive in the sector as well, and experienced exactly those kind of situations as well. But you're also, in your spare time, David, you are a Vice-Chancellor and a Chief Executive of the University of Sunderland. I started university in the 80s, and it was quite a different environment now. How have you seen the university sector change over time, from the 70s, the 80s to where we are now? What's been the key change that you've seen, David?
I suppose the fundamental change was introduced through what was called the Robbins Report in the early 1960s, which in simple terms led to a major expansion of university places. It also led to the opening of a whole raft of new universities like Lancaster, Keele, the University of East Anglia, Bath, and so on. So that was a major period of expansion. And that ran really from the 60s through to the mid-90s. And then we saw another major expansion of higher education. So I suppose the defining feature of British higher education over the past half century or so has been its growth and expansion. Now that's brought some tensions, obviously, along the way, but it's the job of people like me and my colleagues here at the university to make all of that work. But I see vividly people who are experiencing what I experienced those 4+ decades ago, the first in family to go to university, the opportunity to put my life on a different track, and the chance to go on and do things that I would have never dreamt of if I hadn't had the opportunity to go to university. That story was true for me when I first arrived at Glasgow University in 1977. I see it here again as we started the 2024-25 academic year. And maybe more than anything, that's what gives me that continuing energy and enthusiasm for this role, that we are making a huge difference to the lives of many people, actually of all ages, not just 18, 19, 20-year-olds, but the people who come back into education and do degrees or other qualifications later in life. So the story of growth, I know in some people's eyes has been, oh, more means less. No, more has meant more, and so much more.
And I reflect again on my own experience. I too was the first one in my family to go to university. And then when I returned to Newcastle a few years ago, I experienced exactly the same thing, and doing my master's course, but seeing the diversity of students from both the UK and overseas, and the number of different courses that you can do, which I guess takes me on to the University of Sunderland. From my nephew graduated from there in the summer. Sunderland's been nominated to be University of the Year. You have partnerships with London, with Hong Kong. You're approaching 20,000 enrolled students. How do you manage to compete? What's the mantra of the University of Sunderland in a relatively crowded space in just the north? So Newcastle, Northumbria, Teesside, York, Leeds, all of those areas. What is it about? How would you pitch coming to Sunderland for a student, David?
Yes, it's such an important point about the competitive nature of higher education. Students have got quite a significant amount of choice. Most universities too will have a lot of places available, but they'll be competitive among students. So some courses are very competitive to get into. Courses that we run here, for example, like medicine and midwifery, incredibly competitive, significant numbers of applicants for every place. But you're right, institutions also compete. Now, I don't think a university can be unique Jeremy, because in some ways we all do broadly the same thing. We teach students, they learn, we do research, we transfer that knowledge out to the wider world. But I think what you can do is to try to talk about the distinctiveness of what you do. And I think we've as it were, pitched our flag around being a professions-facing university. In other words, the vast majority of courses here lead to a particular professional outcome. So that's a doctor, or a teacher, or a police officer, or a social worker, or an engineer, or a computer scientist, or a creative artist. So it means that there's a whole range of subjects we don't do, but that's fine because other universities do them and offer them. So that professional facing pitch is one that we know works very well with students, not just students from the UK, but from students from overseas. And we try to do that by our staff having a very significant amount of professional experience themselves, and many of them still working in the professions alongside teaching here. We try to do that by having facilities that very much ape the real world. So, our simulation wards or our cybersecurity suite are exactly what you would find when you go out to either be a cybersecurity specialist or a nurse or a doctor or a paramedic or whatever. So we try to ensure that's the case. And then we try to ensure that when students are here, they're getting good work placement experience. In all the courses we offer that, whether or not the course formally has work experience, like teacher training where you have to be in schools to do that course, but courses where you don't have to be there, we are offering that work placement opportunity. So we're trying to do a number of things, Jeremy, that give students that experience that they will need to fit them for their profession or career of choice.
I saw exactly that when I did all of the open days with my son and daughter as well. And in the old days, you had to send off for your book about the university to find out all about it. I think I must have spent 10 or so weekends at least traveling the country with my now grown-up children. But again, one of them went to, I suppose, a traditional university, and one of them actually went to Northumbria. But I was just completely amazed by the range of things that you could do at university these days. So,
and it's not to suggest in any way, Jeremy, that going to university is the only career track. Lots of people go and do other qualifications. Some people go directly into work and then do qualifications in work. And actually, I think one of the big opportunities for universities is to involve themselves, not just in the degree level opportunities they offer, but to offer all kinds of other opportunities. So, for example, we have here 1,000 students on degree apprenticeships, which, of course, enable people who are working to acquire a degree during working life. We've recently, as a university, acquired a training company called Access Training, which does a lot of work in apprenticeships at different levels. It does a lot of work working with employers to provide bespoke courses that meet their needs. So we, as a university, don't confine ourselves to what we might call the traditional degree approach. We've got that, of course, in spades, but we're also trying to broaden what we do so that the institute, the university, becomes a place of learning and not just simply a place that offers degrees, a place of lifelong learning, because we know that people are going to want to and need to train and retrain throughout their working lives.
David, I think that's a fantastic illustration of why people should come to Sunderland, I think. So thank you for that. David, finally, David, if I could just draw upon 45 years worth of your experience in all of those leadership roles, and I'm sure the audience will have taken a great deal from what they've heard today. I think you've mentioned it to a certain extent already, but is there any kind of advice that you would give the listeners, the audience, as to how to be effective themselves? You talked about the consistency. Is there anything else that would sum up the secret of leadership, David?
I'm very nervous when asked that kind of question, Jeremy, because the last thing I would want to put my self-forward as some kind of leadership guru. And in fact, what I always say to people, there might not be much wisdom, but there's a wee bit of experience that I've acquired over the years. So perhaps based on experience rather than wisdom. And there's nothing terribly original in this, but it's be yourself. You know, I like to think, going back to the predictability point, that people know who I am. But I would also hope that when people meet me outside, they would say, oh, that's David. And that's exactly the David we know and we see and we're used to at work, as we see in his personal and private life. First of all, you'll just be more comfortable being yourself. You know, you won't be putting on an act, and you won't be always worrying, is this the real me? That's such an important reason. I think also, and I know there's a lot of talk in leadership circles about authenticity, but there is deep truth there, that people want to see you as somebody who is not just somebody who says they are something, but somebody who actually is something, and this is their true self. And then thirdly, and perhaps this is what underpins that be yourself, is you're then true to the values that you have. And the values of the value of education, the value of opportunity, the value of giving people the chance in life to set their own direction. Those things are deeply embedded in me, and they are who I am. So that is me. And I would just encourage people to have the confidence to be themselves. Yes, they'll have all kinds of advice. They'll have all kinds of pressures. They'll talk to coaches. They'll read books. But be yourself.
David, I know people go on leadership courses and spend weeks and months going through qualifications. I think in the last 40 minutes, we could use that as a complete masterclass in leadership skills and techniques.
Very generous, Jeremy.
Thank you so much. I know that the audience will have found this discussion amazingly interesting for us, and that insight into different organizations. It's been my privilege, David. Thank you again today.
Jeremy, thank you for the conversation, and thank you for what you're doing, I know, to encourage and develop the current and the next generation of leaders.
Oh, that's very kind of you. David, thank you again for being on the Clarendon Chronicles podcast. Much appreciated. And I'll be seeing you in about 4 to 5 weeks' time, I think, when we have our strategy day at Karbon, I believe.
See you soon, Jeremy. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, David, again.